Hi, and thank you for joining us for our angelMD webinar series to talk to and meet our terrific companies. Today we're going to be talking to Graham Randall from Noninvasix about his new technology to help with infant neonatal oxygenation issues. angelMD is a platform that brings together the largest network of physician and angel investors that have innovative medical startups. And angelMD members get exclusive access to evaluate and advise the next generation of healthcare companies. And in the most promising cases, the opportunity to invest and shape the future of patient care. I'd like to introduce Dr. Joe Macaluso, who is a member of our scientific advisory board, who has met and spent a lot of time with Graham Randall. And he's going to talk to us about his exposure and experience with Noninvasix. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Joe. Joe, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Warren. It's my pleasure. Very quickly, I had the pleasure of meeting Graham back in January at a presentation he did in Houston, Texas, and became very fascinated because of my personal experience as a physician and actually even as a medical student. I used to work as an IV extern at one of the largest hospitals in New Orleans, and I would get called out all hours of the night to the neonatal unit to start IVs and whatnot on very small premature babies. So I early on got a very strong feeling for the difficulties these young persons have. And when I listened to Graham's presentation, it struck me that this was something that was just really of great value medically, to be able to aid in assessing the most important, perhaps, vital sign in the neonatal nursery, and that's brain oxygenation. So we began to talk, and over the last few months, we've gotten to know each other a bit, and I've become very impressed with the process they're using, and I'm very excited that Graham is able to join us to give us some information about Noninvasix.
Great. I can't advance. Oh, there it is. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate this opportunity to present to angelMD. We've got a really exciting technology, and I think the angelMD investor network can appreciate it. So just to dive in, the problem that we're addressing is brain hypoxia, which is low levels of oxygen in the brain, and it's a major cause of death and permanent disability in newborns. It's the cause of 23% of all neonatal death worldwide, and about a third of the survivors face severe and lifelong disability, including epilepsy and cerebral palsy. And it's also, in the U.S., it's the 9th most expensive hospital condition, costing on average $7 billion, requiring about $20,000 per incidence, and 16 days in the NICU. And as I'm sure most of the people on this webinar are aware, the NICU is the second most expensive bed in the hospital. So if we can reduce the length of stay in the NICU, we can reduce costs to hospitals. So as we dig in on this problem, every year there are 340,000 low birth weight and very low birth weight babies born in the United States. They are all at increased risk for brain hypoxia, which I mentioned is low levels of oxygen in the brain over a period of minutes to hours. And it's caused by the fact that they're simply premature. They have immature vascularization, and they have impaired cerebral blood flow regulation. Right now, we have no way of reliably monitoring the oxygenation of a baby's brain. And so what we detect is injury using MRI or EEG 6 to 24 hours after the hypoxic event has occurred. And we treat it with hypothermic therapy, which has been shown to be neuroprotective. But that must begin within 6 hours of hypoxia. And as I mentioned, we have no way of reliably detecting hypoxia. Noninvasix, what we need is a technology that allows us to detect hypoxia before it causes injury. This would allow clinicians to intervene by administering vasopressors to increase blood pressure, by giving volume or red blood cell transfusions, or by increasing ventilator support. And based on our experience with adults, we know that we can reduce injury by 50 to 75%. Noninvasix has developed just such a technology, and it's going to revolutionize the NICU by allowing neonatologists to directly, accurately, and non-invasively monitor the oxygenation of the baby's brain in real time. The technology was developed with over $6 million in DoD and NIH grant funding at the University of Texas Medical Branch. It's been proven in animal and human testing, including adults, neonates, and fetuses, and it's protected by 7 issued patents, which we've licensed from the University of Texas. We have met with the FDA. We have an agreed-upon de novo 510(k) pathway. This means the FDA considers this a non-significant risk device. So let's look at how OPTOACOUSTICS works.
Noninvasix has developed a cerebral monitor for those at-risk babies that measures the amount of oxygen in the brain in real time. Because baby skulls are still forming after birth, we can use the front and back fontanelles to access the superior sagittal sinus. How does it work exactly? The monitor sends 2 pulsing frequencies of safe, near-infrared light into the brain. Hemoglobin in the blood absorbs the light at different frequencies, depending on whether or not it is carrying oxygen. Absorption causes rapid thermal expansion of the hemoglobin, resulting in a measurable acoustic wave. Our proprietary software analyzes the signal and returns an absolute measurement of oxygen saturation in the superior sagittal sinus.
The key thing to understand here is we know the XY coordinates of where we put our probe, and we know the time of flight of sound through tissue. So we know the Z coordinate of where the signal originates. So this is the first non-invasive technology that allows for the non-invasive measurement of the oxygenation in specific blood vessels. This is the first technology that allows us to look at the oxygenation of veins. You can't do that with any other non-invasive technology. So how is brain oxygenation monitored today? In adults, it's not so unusual, but in the NICU, it's still not very frequently measured. In adults, the gold standard is the jugular bulb catheter, but it's invasive, it's difficult to use, and it's not suitable for neonates. Their blood vessels are too small to be catheterized. Pulse oximetry is ubiquitous, but it's not specific to brain oxygenation. All these babies are already on pulse ox, and it's not working. Near-infrared spectroscopy is a technology that's been out for a couple of decades, but it hasn't received widespread adoption. And the reason is that there's a big problem with inter- and intra-patient variability. You can put the sensor on the right side of the forehead, you get a different number from the left side. Non-invasive technology was developed as a non-invasive alternative to the gold standard, to the jugular bulb catheter. But it's easy to use, it's non-invasive, and therefore it's suitable for neonates. And we can offer it at a price that's competitive with near-infrared spectroscopy. So we've developed 3 generations of these monitors. The monitor on the left is our first laboratory prototype. Then we built our first medical grade system that we took into human studies in the trauma center at Bentop Hospital here in Houston. This thing was massive. It was about the size of a washing machine. It had a water-cooled OPO laser, which allowed us to fine-tune the frequencies we wanted to use. And then we built a custom, a system built on a custom laser diode subsystem. It was FDA compliant. It was a much smaller footprint. As you can see, it was about a 13-inch by 13-inch square footprint. Fortunately, within the last 2 years, laser diodes have become commercially available that meet our specifications, so we won't have to build custom lasers in the future. And we can offer this at a price, as I mentioned, it's competitive with near-infrared spectroscopy. So here's just a sample of our data. We've done a lot of animal studies because we can't ethically put a catheter into anybody's brain. This study was with a sheep. We would drill a hole through the skull into the superior sagittal sinus, insert a catheter, put our probe on the surface of the scalp, and then the sheep, we could control the inhaled oxygen to the sheep, and we can go up and down through several cycles of oxygenation. And you can see very close agreement between both the measurements. The FDA was very impressed with this graph. We've also done studies with PREEMIES in the NICU. Of course, we don't have a reference number to compare them against, but the measurements are all what you would expect for stable babies in the 55 to 80% range. So now, as far as clinical trials go, we've discussed with the FDA 2 very small trials, about 42 patients in all. There's an ISO standard for testing oximeters. You need 200 data points compared to a reference. It doesn't even specify the number of patients. So for accuracy, we've designed a study that would use 22 healthy adult volunteers. We put a catheter into a vein in their arm. We put our probe on the surface of the skin, and then we can control the oxygen range with a tourniquet on the arm. And then the second study is our safety study. The biggest safety concern the FDA had with our device is the risk of pressure ulcers. And so we'll use about 20 babies in the NICU, low birth weight and very low birth weight babies, and we'll show that our device has no issues with pressure ulcers. So we've got some great testimonials. Dr. Gary Hankins, who is the chair of the ACOG's task force on neonatal encephalopathy, said this technology has the potential to eliminate up to 90% of cases of HIE and subsequent permanent brain injuries, such as cerebral palsy. And our NIH review committee said that this is huge, game-changing clinically, and likely to succeed. Reimbursement is one of those issues that comes up frequently. In this case, it's not a big issue because the babies in the NICU are all reimbursed either fee for service or on a DRG, a diagnosis-related group. So we won't have to go out and get a CPT code to pay for the use of this device. And because it's a DRG, that means the hospital receives a lump sum payment for the care of a premature baby. So anything the hospital can do to reduce those costs is accretive to the bottom line. And that feeds into our value analysis. With the help of LA Children's Hospital, we commissioned a third-party value analysis to look at both the short-term and the long-term cost savings of using this device. And the results were quite impressive. From the short-term point of view, a typical NICU with 12 beds servicing 300 babies a year could save $1.1 million a year by reducing the burden of hypoxia. That's additional nurse monitoring requirements, transportation costs, drugs, MRIs, hypothermic therapy. And that's all in addition to impressive reductions in death and disability. And then from the long-term cost savings perspective, the payers could expect to save $2.4 to $6.2 million a year by reducing the lifetime direct medical costs of hypoxia-induced cerebral palsy. Historically, cost savings to payers haven't really influenced hospital purchasing decisions, but this is changing as the industry moves towards accountable care organizations. Here in Texas, we are 100% Medicaid ACO. So if we can reduce the long-term costs of these children with cerebral palsy, that is a profit maker for or cost reduction to the hospital itself. So as I mentioned earlier, this technology was originally developed for soldiers with traumatic brain injury, and it actually has a lot of applications throughout the hospital. We can take our monitor with the console, the software, the cables. We can couple it with a high-powered or low-powered laser, depending on how deep into the tissue we need to penetrate or whether we need to penetrate bone. We can address a lot of different issues in the hospital: intracranial hematoma diagnosis, adult brain oximetry, central venous oximetry, neonatal brain oximetry, fetal brain oximetry, total hemoglobin monitoring, and extracorporeal monitoring. And so the market opportunity for non-invasive technology is actually quite large, over $5 billion in the United States and nearly $13 billion worldwide. We're starting in the pediatric market because it's a $1 billion opportunity, there's a desperate need, and there's no established competition. But it can very quickly expand out to adult brain oximetry, and then from there we can do central venous oximetry, which allows us to diagnose and manage shock and sepsis. And ultimately, what we think is the biggest market opportunity is total hemoglobin monitoring. The total hemoglobin blood test is the most commonly ordered blood test today. We can do it non-invasively and continuously. And so we think this has the potential to be the next vital sign. Our team is experienced. This is the third startup that I've run as the CEO. I have my PhD in molecular biophysics from Banner College of Medicine and my MBA from Rice. Our founders and co-founders, Dr. Pro and Dr. Senilev, are both professors at the University of Texas Medical Branch. Dr. Pro is the chair of anesthesiology. Dr. Senilev is a professor of bioengineering. And they've got two great advisors, Dr. Brett Giroir, who was recently nominated to be Assistant Secretary of Health, was previously the president of the Texas A&M Health Sciences Center, and was the chief medical officer of Dallas Children's Hospital. And then Dr. Gary Hankins, who I mentioned earlier, was the chairman of the ACOG Task Force on Neonatal Encephalopathy. We've got some great partners and awards. We went through the new Texas Medical Center Accelerator. We were a resident at the new J-Labs at Texas Medical Center Incubator. We've been through the Health Wildcatters program up in Dallas, and then we are a member of the Consortium for Technology and Innovation in Pediatrics at LA Children's Hospital. This is a center that's been funded by the FDA because the FDA perceives that pediatric devices are an underfunded and underserved market. And so they're out there, this center is helping pediatric device companies bring products to market. We're the first prize at $100,000 winner at the Texas New Ventures competition. We were a finalist in the Cleveland Clinic Innovations Prize. And last year we took second place at Impact Pediatric Health, which was a pitch competition at South by Southwest. It was judged by 8 of the top children's hospitals. The judges were all neonatologists and pediatric intensivists. They grilled me really hard, and so second prize, we were very happy with that result. So where are we today? Well, we've raised over $2 million in non-dilutive grants and equity. We've built 3 generations of clinical prototypes, which we've tested in sheep, adults, neonates, and fetuses. We've met with the FDA twice. We have an agreed-upon 510K pathway, and we've issued IP, and we're aggressively managing that portfolio. And where are we heading? We're currently raising a Series A. We're raising $3 million on the first tranche to build the manufacturing prototype. When we met with the FDA, they made it very clear they didn't want to see any data from a non-final device. So we need to build that final device before we can move to clinical trials. We expect to be able to fund most of our clinical trial activity with a phase 2 SBIR, and then we would be ready for launch about 2.5 years out. At that point, I think that would be our first potential exit opportunity, or we could choose to go it alone and raise another $10 million in a Series B. Our exit strategy: we would expect to be acquired by a tissue monitoring, patient monitoring, or tissue oximetry company like Masimo or Medtronic. As a comparable, Somanetics, which was a company that invented near-infrared spectroscopy, they sold to Covidien for $250 million in 2010. That was 5 times revenues, and I think a good indicator of how strategic tissue oximetry can be. Our use of funds for the first milestone is what you would expect. The bulk of the funding would go towards developing the final product and a lot of IP. And then our 5-year pro forma, we looked at the top 40 birthing centers in the country. They cluster where you would expect: California, Florida, Texas, and New England. We can cover those regions with 4 or 5 salespeople, and that could support $30 million a year in recurring revenue. And based off the Somanetics comparable I mentioned earlier, we estimate a 10x return on the investment to the Series A investors. So I'd like to end with a quote from Bill Gates recently. He said that saving children's lives is the best deal in philanthropy. And of course, we expect our investors to want to get a good financial return, but I'd like to mention that there is a very big indirect or impact that you can make with this investment, and we can do a lot of good. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I welcome any questions.
Graham, that was awesome. Thank you very much. You covered a lot of ground, and I'll try not to be redundant in any questions, but I have a few thoughts. You've already talked about the obvious problem that exists and the rationale for non-invasics and the technology, and you've described some of the research that you've done in the area to kind of prove proof of concept to show that it works. Are there any particular entities that Non-Invasix has partnered with in building the actual device? And if so, do they have a track record in healthcare in any way, in startup development?
Yeah, so we've partnered with a firm actually here in Houston, which was surprising to be, called Biotex. Biotex is the team that commercialized Visualase. Visualase is a technology for doing laser ablation in pediatric neurosurgery. And they sold that company to Medtronic in 2014 for $105 million. And I just happened to be giving a pitch at JLabs last year, and the CEO came up to me afterwards and said, "Graham, I love it. We love the pediatric market, and we get lasers. We want to build this device." And so one of the biggest challenges I had in finding an engineering firm to build this for us was finding people with the optical expertise, the laser expertise. And so the fact that these guys have that in spades and they're located here in Houston was just very serendipitous. So I'm really, really pleased with the team we have.
That's awesome. Then you talked about the potential market and the future market opportunities. I wanted to touch back on something, because this is something I think potential investors are always interested in. You mentioned your patent portfolio. Could you go over that again? And I think you had just gotten some pretty significant extensions on those out to the 2030s or somewhere in there. Can you elaborate on that?
Right, so we have 7 issued patents. The most recent patent was issued last summer for fetal monitoring, and it gives us protection into 2035. In the last several months, we have nationalized that patent, so we have protection in Canada, Japan, China, Europe, and Australia. We have a pending patent application for neonatal monitoring, and we will nationalize that one in the same countries. And then last year, we also filed a provisional patent application for incorporating our technology into ultrasound systems. We think there's a really cool opportunity for incorporating optoacoustics into point-of-care ultrasound. Basically, you could use the ultrasound to target a vein or a blood vessel, click a button, and get the oxygenation from that vein. We think that would be a very useful feature.
Sounds like you're inventing the Star Trek tricorder to some degree, perhaps. And you mentioned other applications, and you specifically talked about hemoglobin. Is that the most immediate, and are there other ones that you are working on as well?
Well, hemoglobin has been further off. Hemoglobin is a much harder problem than oxygenation. With oxygenation, you bombard the hemoglobin with two different frequencies. You get two signals back. You take their ratio to get the oxygen saturation. And when you take that ratio, a lot of the sources of error cancel out. And so when we're measuring an absolute hemoglobin concentration, we no longer have that cancellation of the errors, and so we need to develop corrections for all the sources of errors, melanin being one of them. And so we've done a lot of studies over the last couple of years with specifically dark-skinned individuals in order to perfect and increase the accuracy of our melanin corrections. And we've made a lot of progress. And in one of our most recent studies with babies, preterm babies in the NICU, with a variety of skin types and melanin concentrations, we got a 95% confidence interval of plus or minus 1.06 grams per deciliter, which most of the listeners to this webinar, I'm sure, know that that's very much within clinical relevancy, and it's much better than the only other non-invasive hemoglobin monitor on the market offered by Masimo.
Do you have any, does the company have any patent applications for these other applications pending?
Well, we have issued patents on hemoglobin already.
Awesome, very good. Now, you mentioned funding, and obviously you have a variety of funding needs. So in the immediate short term, describe again what you think your funding need is over the next, say, 12 months.
Well, so over the next 18 months, I'll give you that. We need $3 million in order to build that final manufacturing prototype. So we're going to need about a year to build the product, and then there's another 6 months to do all of the third-party testing that the FDA requires. That's laser safety and electromagnetic compatibility, that kind of testing. So over the next 18 months, we need $3 million. Then we expect we'll need about 1.6 to 2 million to do the clinical studies and get the 510K, and that's another 12 months. At that point, then we'll be looking to exit or to raise a Series B to support our go-to-market.
Very good. Tell me again, you mentioned exit strategies and you mentioned several potentials. Have you explored that with any of those companies or spoken to anyone with those companies to date about potentially lining up with you?
Absolutely. I'm a big believer in talking to everybody early and often. So we've met with everybody on that slide and then some. And the reason I do that is I want them to know what we're doing. I want to get on their radar. I want them to be following our progress, as well as I want to understand what they're looking for. So, when I talk to a patient monitoring company, and they say, oh, we've already got sales guys calling on the NICU. We've got a huge established base of the NICU. This would be awesome as a plug-in module to our monitor. Then I'm thinking about, well, okay, what's some step we need to make this a plug-in module? But then I talk to another company, and they say, in our portfolio we have a product that does hemodynamic monitoring, but we don't have SpO2 and we don't have total hemoglobin. We need the doctors need to do a blood test before they can use our product. And so I offer to them and say, hey, this is a technology that has both. We can offer you both of those technologies non-invasively, and then you have an all-in-one package that you can sell. And so we're a strategic offering to them as well. So I go out. I talk to as many strategics as I can in order to understand what they're looking for and how we might fit into their portfolio.
Well, I think that's important because my experience is that many of these types of technologies that are transformational, sometimes these larger companies were very interested in acquisition even before a 510K is finalized because they want to get hold of the patents and so forth. So I want to just emphasize that. Not that that's necessarily what you will do or what we will do, but it's certainly something to consider.
Right, let me just interrupt, because one of the companies we've talked to is currently developing a fetal monitor, and they're in the early stages of planning. And so, that might be one of the opportunities for an early exit is, if they want to incorporate our technology into their fetal monitor now, that we just strategically might be a good fit right at this time. So yeah, you're right. I mean, there is an opportunity to exit before that 510K.
Awesome. Well, that's about all I think I have at this time. It's been a fascinating discussion and greatly appreciate the presentation. And I remain very enthusiastic and impressed with the work that you've done. And I want to ask John or Oren from AngelMD if they have any closing comments for the potential listeners and comments about syndication and so forth.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that. And Graham, that was a terrific presentation. Joe, great questions. I think that would really help our audience understand what you guys are doing at Noninvasix. And it really sounds fascinating and like important work. I hope that we can generate some interest and raise some capital for your company. Graham, if you could advance your slide to the final slide, there's contact information for AngelMD on it. And the next steps would be for the viewers of this webinar to go to the website and follow Noninvasix as angelmd.co. They could send an email directly to me at Orin, O-R-R-I-N, at angelmd.co to indicate interest. And if they follow the company, they will get all of the updates with respect to the upcoming syndicate. So that would be the best way to get involved. Okay. On that note, I'd like to thank everybody for coming tonight. John Leader for coordinating everything. Graham Randall, CEO of Noninvasix, and Dr. Joe Macaluso, the syndicate leader for this upcoming syndicate. Really appreciate all of your time, and I wish you all the best of the